This is a huge issue which has been greatly neglected by governments and the media. And I mentioned before that there's been 10 years of scientific papers warning that the food system itself is in serious systemic trouble. But when I read these papers and when I see the response, it's almost as if those scientists are behind a sheet of plate glass and you can see their hands banging on the glass and you can see their lips moving, but no one can hear what they're saying because there's just no penetration at all in the media. There's no penetration in public life. People aren't hearing it. And when I try to explain these things, they say, oh, you're talking about environmental issues. I say, yeah, I'm also talking about environmental issues. But in this case, this is the systemic nature of the problem. And I got to the point reading these papers that I realize that the greatest threat to the global food system is the global food system. It's the way that it's structured makes that system extremely fragile, and it could suffer the kind of cascading collapse which can happen in complex systems very rapidly indeed. Now, that collapse very nearly happened in the financial system in 2008, and governments poured trillions of dollars into that system to push it back into a safer space. And they did so in a very inequitable way. It wasn't a great way of solving the problem, but at least they stopped that system from collapsing. And they were able to do so by creating future money. That's what quantitative easing meant, making future money out of thin air. And you can do that in the financial system. But if the global food system reaches that point, you can't save it by creating future food. You can't just invent future food. Now, had the financial system gone down, it would have caused immense suffering for people all over the world. But if the food system goes down, I mean, it's on a completely different scale altogether. We can't even imagine what that would look like. Basically, the rich would eat and nobody else would. You know, it would be a catastrophe on a scale we just can't picture. And the signs are really not good. So first of all, you've got this extreme corporate concentration, very similar to the corporate concentration in the financial sector, except even worse than it was in the financial sector before 2008. So to give one example, 4 corporations control 90% of the global grain trade. And the global grain trade, as we know, is crucial to the survival of billions of people, but it's in the hands of this tiny number of corporations, and governments have made no attempt whatsoever to break those corporations up and to relieve the hold that they have over the food system. At the same time, the system's been losing its diversity. We've seen a global convergence towards what some people call the global standard diet. Our food has become locally more diverse, but globally less diverse. You walk into a supermarket here in the UK, or a supermarket catering to people of the same socioeconomic status in India or in the United States or in the Philippines, almost wherever you are in the world, you see a very similar range of food supplied by the same corporations. And you have a greater diversity of food than your grandparents might have known, but it's the same diversity of food as people on the other side of the world are facing. And that's the development of the global standard diet. And that has been pushed on and reinforced by the global standard farm, where people all over the world are using the same machinery, the same seeds, the same chemicals, the same techniques, driven by these big corporations who are pushing this same model everywhere. And that stripping out of diversity makes a system less resilient. It increases systemic fragility. And even, even before you look at all the environmental issues bearing on this, the social issues, just from a systems point of view, that makes it dangerous. And then you see that all these big corporations have been pursuing the maximum efficiency, and that makes perfect sense from the corporate point of view. But in the system as a whole, it reduces the spare capacity of that system. In systems theory talk, it reduces the redundancy of the system. Again, that makes it more fragile. Then we see this global standardization of trade. So we have exactly the same railheads, exactly the same container sizes, exactly the same regulations. And that reduces what systems theorists call the modularity of a system, the degree to which it's compartmentalized. And so if a shock starts in one part of the system, it can then propagate across the entire system and potentially bring it down. And there's a whole series of other ways in which this system has been undermined and made more fragile. And we could easily end up with a situation where a relatively small shock, like the US subprime crisis, which was tiny by comparison to the scale of global financial transactions, could be enough to tip the whole system over. And then we see the cascading failure of those big corporations, which have each become too big to fail, as the banks were. And then, boom, there is no global food system. Almost overnight. This is a genuinely terrifying prospect. And I want to almost grab people by the lapels and shake them and say, wake up to this. This is so important. And people are not talking about it.